Hi, I'm Lisa Dethridge from GLab at RMIT, and I'm here to welcome Professor Damian Schofield, who is here from State University of New York in the town of Oswego in upstate New York. Damian, you are an expert in robotics, in artificial intelligence, in 3D graphics, forensics. You do a lot of work in what people would call perhaps some artificial life, but you look real to me. What's going on there?
Well, many years ago I did my PhD in artificial intelligence. Then I moved out and started working with computer game environments, computer game graphics, and particularly applying that in forensics and education. And recently, when I moved to America, I worked here at RMIT for a while, and then I moved to America, and upon starting my job at Oswego, I got a grant to buy some of these now robots, $20,000 each. We bought 3 of them. And so I'm now known on my campus as the robot guy. We've had these for a few years now, and we've been doing all sorts of things with them. We're using them to give health information to children. We've been teaching them to fire bow and arrows. We've been teaching them to dance. And recently we've been doing robot theatre productions with them. And one of the interesting things for me is how people interpret when they see these robots performing an activity which is normally seen as a human activity. And what I'm really interested in is the human response, which is very similar to your response. Immediately you hear the term artificial life and you have this kind of scary reaction. And it's the same as when we say, oh, we've got robots doing theatre. People think, oh, that's not quite right, that's a human activity. And that's what interests me, pushing those boundaries of what people see as normal, and how they interpret the things we do, and how we can experiment with that and see what we can do to pacify those emotions.
Right. Perhaps I could explain that you've brought a group of American students here to work with a group of RMIT students who are going to be making film productions together using robots as characters. And part of the challenge, I suppose, for the understanding of the robot as character is that it helps us understand who we are as humans, doesn't it? We're different to robots, or are we? Am I just a robot, or am I a human? What aspects of me are similar to a robot?
We had an interesting conversation today on this. We've been walking around RMIT and we went to see your new fancy big robot in the basement here. And I was talking to you about the fact that when we study artificial intelligence, it teaches us more about who we are as humans than just the development of artificial intelligence technology. And my belief is that having robots perform a theatre production helps us understand who we are as humans interpreting theatre. We've just done a performance over in Oswego of Waiting for Godot using robots, and it's such a kind of contemplative play about the nature of humanity. To see it performed by robots makes you step back and reinterpret what you're watching. And that's what I hope we'll do. We're working with your students here to produce these films which will challenge what people normally think about when they're watching a little conversation between 2 people. If we switch one of those people for a robot, does it change your interpretation of what you're seeing?
Does it change our interpretation of what it is to be human?
Absolutely.
We've been discussing these questions in class, haven't we? The American students and the Australian students have been using a virtual classroom setup, just a very simple
video conferencing
mechanism, and they've been meeting online for a few weeks. They get together once a week. They first of all did a meet and greet, then the Australian students developed a series of questions for the American students to go away and research, knowing that the Aussies were going to be writing the script about the robots, and we suggested that it be a comedy script, and they had questions for your students, didn't they, such as, can a robot feel, can a robot fall in love? And the Oswego students then went and did some research around this, which led them into all kinds of interesting corners of the field, everything from philosophy, English literature, neuroscience, artificial intelligence, computer programming, because really the understanding of robotics and artificial intelligence is multidisciplinary, isn't it, Damien? We need to understand physiology, psychology. It's quite complex.
Well, I can back up that that statement by the fact that we've just run this transhumanism class, and I have co-taught it with a English philosophy professor, and I have learned more in this class about the nature of intelligence than I have in all the years I studied artificial intelligence.
Wow.
And this idea of bringing in other fields, we talk about this a lot, about interdisciplinarity, the importance of this. I've loved the fact that what we've been doing is putting students together from very different backgrounds. We've had English grad students, graphic design students, computer scientists, with your creative writing students, and we've been putting them in groups to talk to each other about these problems, these issues. And the discussions are so much richer than if you just have people from one discipline.
Yes, because it often seems that even though they might be speaking using a different set of terms, on one level the language feels a little different. In the end, they are still talking the same language, so that if you have a group of computer science students who are trying to define intelligence on one hand and a group of philosophers who are trying to define intelligence on the other hand, they do meet in the middle. And in our class, it's been actually the figure of the robot who has allowed that discussion to take place. It's as though the robot symbolically forms a kind of a model for our humanity that allows us to step outside ourselves, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The philosophers have really introduced us to the fact that in some ways, you were talking about the terms, they've let us know that the language we use and the terms we use are inadequate in many ways. As we develop these, as we evolve as humans around this technology, we are using theories and terms and language that isn't really adequate to describe what's happening. And we need to evolve a new way of thinking. And what we tend to do is impose, again, something we've talked about a lot, our own definitions of humanity, whereas the consciousness that is evolving through robots and artificial intelligence, why does it have to be like us? Why can it not be something different? And we've discussed this in many different forms about the evolution of these artificial life, artificial intelligence mechanisms throughout this class. And it's been interesting that we've not only had reference to Renaissance philosophers, Greek philosophers, artificial intelligence theory, computer science.
Science fiction is big in the middle of this.
We've been pulling in all this pop culture, media culture of science fiction. We've been reading novels and doing literary criticism of these novels as well. It's been an amazing experience pulling all these things together.
Because transhumanism also includes other areas of scientific endeavour such as genetic engineering and bioengineering, where we are working with tools that are manipulating the genome, for example. Again, back to stuff that's slightly threatening, because what we're actually doing is exploring the limits of our knowledge of our own humanity. And when you get to that sort of bleeding edge of the field, where people are, engaged with genetic engineering and cloning and so on, there's a lot of areas there that really need pretty careful examination. You know, the ethical questions around how do we treat our robots, for example. How do you treat a robot? Does a robot have feelings? In asking that question, some people might think that's a silly question, but of course it allows us to reflect yet again on how do we treat each other, really.
Absolutely. The students had to do individual group research projects, working in groups in our classroom. And one of the projects they looked at was an emotional attribution to robots. And they particularly referenced a number of experiments where a robot was, how people felt about switching off a robot. So they worked with the robot for a period of time, formed some form of relationship and attachment with this robot, and then had to turn the robot off. And normally, like turning off a computer or turning off a microwave, they switched it off. But in another group, the robot begged for its life and explained that it would lose its memory if they turned it off. And people were reluctant to turn it off. They didn't want to turn it off. So this idea of how we feel and the ethics of how we treat these machines, we can project our humanity onto them very, very easily by tricking people.
It's a kind of a process of anthropomorphication.
Absolutely.
Isn't it? Where you were saying we project our humanity, we imagine something which could in one set of definitions just be seen as an inanimate object, a machine, but we somehow project or imagine that there is a sense of life force in that creature.
The interesting thing was your students in writing these scripts captured that. The questions they were asking were, I'm thinking particularly of there's one of the scripts which is really great because it has a very Australian character talking to a robot, trying to be a friend of the robot, and the robot not understanding.
Using Aussie language.
She'll
be
language.
Right, mate.
She'll
Put a
be
prawn
right.
on the Barbie, stuff like that.
But trying to be, the human needs a friend and projects onto the robot, and the robot struggles to understand and comprehend why this human needs this friendship. So that your student has captured this exact question in that little script, which we hope to film.
And our understanding of the way human emotion, human expectation, qualities like human anger, jealousy, envy, hope, all the good stuff, all the not so good stuff that makes us human. It's the project of computer scientists these days to actually try and reproduce that set of conditions.
Not all computer scientists, but
like with the Neo, for example, which is a lovely looking little, we call it a humanoid robot because it still has a human form. It has 2 arms, 2 legs, a head, some eyes. Are you working on programs for this robot that will enable it to behave in a more human fashion? And if so, what's the goal?
In my research, we're not really developing new technology. I'm more interested in measuring the reaction of humans to the robot technology. So we've run projects which are very much based on emotion. One project, for example, was on facial recognition. If the robot recognizes your face and calls you by name in a group of people, do you feel a more emotional attachment to that robot? Of course you do. But we could empirically measure that and test it and evaluate that. We've also had projects where the robot positions itself in postures which are generally seen as conveying a particular emotion. And we can assess the impact that has on the humans who are interacting with the robot. We're also running projects in hospitals where we're using the robots to impart medical information to small children, because the small children are scared of doctors in this unfriendly environment. Our robots are very cute, and the children perceive the robot as a kind of toy, non-threatened. Surprisingly, the robot is less threatening than a human doctor, and the children will engage more, remember more. What we're finding is that only works at certain ages. The children can be too old or too young for that to work, but we're doing experiments on children to see how they react to getting this information. So the emotional aspect is very important. What I will say is that I personally also have a belief that a human is also a form of machine. We're a biological machine, and what neuroscientists are now showing us is they can put electrodes into the brain, target specific areas, change electrical signals, and change your emotions, and change your feeling of hope, your ambition, your happiness by manipulating those signals in the brain. And it becomes a very interesting question about how that changes us as humans, and why is that different to what we do with a robot.
So we're back at these really basic, large philosophical questions about what defines us.
Which is what we've been talking about in our class.
What defines our humanity? Yeah.
I'm not going to answer that question. Not in one line.
It's interesting also what you were saying about the robots being useful both in relation to the care of children, and I believe the Neo robot, which has been developed by a French company called Aldebaran, by the way, and there's quite a lot of research going on globally around these robots. They're used in the care and treatment of autistic people, or autistic children, and the elderly.
That's right.
So clearly we're going to learn a lot more about what it is in an elderly population who's in special care, that is. What it is about the robot that seems to give certain kinds of people permission to feel an emotional response, which they might not be able to achieve with a fellow human. That's interesting as well. So we're learning a lot about human neurology, gerontology, you know, the care of old people, our physiology, and as you say, observing humans in interaction with robots is how we're going about this. And tell me, is the Neo, the robots that you have, are they male or female? Is there a difference?
We have red and blue robots, and people impose gender on them because of our social construction of colour.
Okay.
However, my personal view is they are non-gendered, and this, if you read a lot of the work of some of the transhuman theorists, particularly the feminist theorists like Donna Haraway and Catherine Hales, one of the things they talk about a lot is how the cyborg idealism and the way we're moving towards this transhuman position is a non-gendered position. It's removing gender. And in our work, for example, with robots in theatre, the gender of the actors has a huge impact on the audience. In a play of Romeo and Juliet, Romeo is traditionally a male, Juliet is a female, and those roles, those
Unless
visual...
it's 1650.
Yeah, exactly.
In which Juliet would have been played by a boy, but anyway.
Still in a dress. So there's still that presentation of female aspect. But by presenting two robots, one of the things I'm very interested in is the play now removes gender. We have two non-gendered forms, humanoid forms, and how does that change the interpretation of the audience who are watching whatever media? And it's going to be interesting in your films, because in all of your plays, one of the actors or both of the actors are robots. And how will the audience interpret the male and female roles of those robots? I'm interested. When we make these films, I'm going to put them in front of audiences and gather some information back on this. And I know there's one of the scripts where there is a male and female robot talking, and the student wants to have a male and female human voice on these robots so that the audience will know they're male and female. And I guess we'll have to use a blue and red robot to reinforce that. But
you'd rather challenge that,
I'd
would
rather
you?
challenge that and have a more neutral voice. But that's probably what we'll do. We were talking about making multiple versions of these performances.
Very interesting.
One with a male and female voice, one with a neutral, non-gendered voice, and see how the audience react to these, because we're challenging their perceptions of what they think they should be saying.
This is also reflecting on the role of the actor in general, because some would argue that actors are robots anyway.
We've had that discussion many times, that during this course, particularly the English philosophy professor we've been working with is a Shakespeare scholar, and he's been talking many times about the fact that actors are pretending on the stage. So if you already have someone pretending on a stage, what's the difference if a robot pretends on the stage? Why would you feel emotion towards one and not towards the other?
Yes, and then you have to ask about the people in the audience, and suppose that we humans are really, to quote a line from Shakespeare, what is it, we strut our stuff upon the stage. Yes, and that we're all actors acting out our script anyway. So this can end up in a circular argument if we're not careful. But meantime, I just want to thank you very much for being here. It's
You're
a very
welcome.
Exciting conversation, and I hope it will continue. We'll catch up with you next time.
I'd like to
you're here.
thank RMIT for hosting us here. It's been a fantastic week so far, and we will be working on another course next year, I believe. So we'll be
Yes.
doing this again next year.
Yes, all in the name of global education,
That's
folks.
Important to both our institutions.
Indeed. State University of New York, Professor Damian Schofield, thank you very much.
No, thank you.
Thank you.